Welcome, everybody. I'm Jim Bitterman of CNN, and I want to thank you all for joining us for another in our series of CECI webinars with authors and opinion leaders. The CECI, the Centre des Études de Communication Internationale, depends on you and events just like this one to raise scholarship funds for deserving communication students to attend classes at the American University of Paris. And I think we may even have a few of those students listening on today's webinar. Our guest today, Tim Alberta, may be well known to many of you for his work as a staff writer for the Atlantic magazine, or in his previous incarnation as a chief political correspondent for Politico. Or you may know his books, American Carnage, as the subtitle explains, a tale from the front lines of the Republican Civil War, and the rise of President Trump, and his most recent book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, all about the rise of American evangelicals in the age of extremism. But what you may not know is that Tim is a devout Christian and the son of an evangelical preacher from Detroit, and as such has an insider's view and has written exclusively about the combustible mix of evangelism and politics. So welcome, Tim, and just a word about logistics before we start. Author in 60 Minutes, producer Barry Lando will take over for a conversation, Tim, in just a few seconds. Since this is a webinar, you've been all muted and will not be able to interact directly, but you can pose questions by writing them into the chat function on your Zoom screen, so Barry and I can pass them along to our guest. Without further delay, let's hand it over to Barry and Tim.
Hi, Jim. Thanks for joining us. Great that you're here. You raise kind of a question, I think, that we used to publicize this webinar. And the question was, how could so many devout Christians be enthralled to, and this is a quote, a lecherous, impenitent scoundrel like Donald Trump? Did you find a simple answer?
Well, yes and no. I suppose it's a very complicated answer that could be distilled down into its simplest form. First of all, I'll say thank you for having me, and I appreciate the warm introduction. Also, I don't know what the general format is or the rules of engagement here, but obviously I heard what you said a moment ago about everyone staying muted and not having a direct engagement. But if people want to turn on their cameras, whenever I do these big webinar things, it's generally nice to see faces and people nodding or scowling or, looking angry at something I've said. So if people want to turn on their cameras, they can feel more than free to do so. My very simple or simplest answer I can give to that question, Barry, is just that there is something uniquely troubling in the American evangelical movement that you just don't find in other parts of the world. You don't see Canadian evangelicals dealing with this sort of issue. You don't see Korean evangelicals or evangelicals in sub-Saharan Africa or in China dealing with this. And this that I'm getting at is the degree to which national identity has come to be in competition with one's faith identity. And I think that's difficult maybe from the outside looking in to understand maybe how this happened or why national identity and sort of an obsessive defensive zeal with safeguarding the kingdom of America as they see it, that many of these people believe that they have inherited not just from their forefathers, not just from their ancestors in this country from previous generations, but really inherited from the Almighty, believing that this is a blessed nation, a nation ordained by God himself, and a nation that must be fought for and defended with a righteous zeal. That is again, a uniquely American phenomenon that we are dealing with. And I think once we recognize the depths of this sort of nationalist identity that has permeated the church and perverted its gospel witness in the culture at large, then we begin to see how a movement like this could be hijacked by bad actors and by culture war profiteers and by political animals who see opportunity for wealth and for power and for prestige and for ultimately for control. And we can also see the great damage that it has done to the church as an institution. So that is the Cliff Notes answer, but I'm happy to get into more details if you'd like.
Yeah, well, how would you define evangelical?
Well, there's a funny story I recount early in the book about how there was a social scientist writing in the, I believe it was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, about how really the term evangelical just meant anyone who liked Billy Graham. And then someone caught up with Billy Graham and they asked him the question and told him about that definition. And they said, well, what do you think an evangelical is? And he said, boy, I'd really like to know the answer. Let me know if you find it. I say that because I think it's important to recognize there is no commonly agreed upon definition of what it means to be an evangelical Christian. Now, that's not to say that there are not that we have nothing to work with, because we do. When we trace back the etymology here, we're really dealing with evangelos from the Greek Septuagint, which is referring to the good news. So the idea of sharing the good news, of carrying that good news, of taking that good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ to all the nations, as Jesus himself instructs his followers. That is the Great Commission that we as Christians are charged with. And so to be an evangelical is to believe at its core, not only in Jesus as being the Messiah and the Son of God, but also to believe that you have that responsibility to evangelize, to turn it from sort of an identity to be an evangelical, but really to turn that identity into an action verb, to evangelize. That is, I think, again, sort of distilled down a good working definition in the spiritual context of what it has commonly been understood to be an evangelical. If I can even add one more bit of theological layering to it, I think the reason that evangelicals were quick in the past, certainly in the past century, to differentiate themselves from what they saw as the sort of staid traditions of the Roman Catholic Church, and even from the more sort of cold and clinical heritage that they saw in the mainline Protestant church. Evangelicals, in contrast, would profess to believe that the Bible was not just a book about God, not just a collection of stories relating back to God and his designs for the world, but that it was the infallible word of God, and that it was God breathed, God authored, and that to be an evangelical meant that you took very seriously then the very literal interpretations in many cases of Scripture and what it said about your life and what it instructed you to do as a believer. So evangelicalism really is, I think, probably best understood. Again, this is more strictly in religious theological terminology, because and I'm emphasizing that because I think it's important to then transition over into what evangelicalism means in many other spaces. But I think the terminology and the identification to be an evangelical has really, in the religious context, been almost a way for very committed, sincere, serious, mature Christians to sort of let the outside world know, hey, I am a very committed, sincere, serious, mature Christian, right? I'm not. I don't just show up on Christmas Eve and Easter and recite John 3:16 once in a while and then pretend to be a disciple of Jesus. No, I'm the real deal. I think.
How is the radical right able then to take over? It sounds so centered on the Bible and teaching. Why should the radical right then be able to move in and take over the movement?
Yeah, and I think if you look back to the 1970s as really where a lot of the problems began, not all of the problems, we've always had some of this tension, but I think if you were to really examine the ways in which some very prominent fundamentalist Christians and some very prominent evangelical Christians sort of merged, and what they shared beyond just their theology, they shared some cultural and political views that were, of course, very much aligned with conservatism, with Republican partisan politics. And what they also shared was this sort of this willingness to traffic in the rhetoric of Armageddon, to try to kind of synthesize their end times biblical theology with their flag waving nationalist instincts and create this narrative around the idea of America being under attack, and that if you understand the way that this country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles, and if you understand the ways in which secular, progressive, humanist, leftist, whatever, pick your adjective, if you understand the way that they have been attacking those core values since the founding of this country, then you will understand, and this is, Jerry Falwell talking, this is Pat Robertson talking, this is any number of these prominent religious right figures in the 1970s, then you will understand that taking prayer out of the public schools, that legalizing abortion on demand, that embracing the sexual revolution and the drug culture, divorce rates spiking, interracial marriage, the attack on the family unit in this country, you will understand that those things are all part of a coordinated assault on Christian America. And the question for you, Christian, out there in Omaha or Tulsa or wherever is, what are you going to do about it? And that rallying cry became incredibly effective and allowed some of these leaders to begin not only raising tens of millions of dollars and building out this colossus, this political colossus, and all of the sort of trappings that come with it, the fame and the airplanes and the television shows and all of this, right? But what it also did was it began to shift the perception, the general public's perception of what it meant to be an evangelical, right? And I think if you were to look at some of the social science, some of the research 50, 60 years ago, what you begin to see is a real shift in how people perceived not just the church at large, but really perceived the white evangelical church. And they began to see the church, certainly by the 1980s and then well into the 1990s and the turn of the century. Many of them began to see the church as being very, very unabashedly political and partisan, but began more specifically even to see or to sort of use evangelical interchangeably with white, conservative, Republican. And so when you think about the exit polling that we have seen in recent elections, and this even predates Donald Trump's arrival on the scene, by the way, although it's certainly accelerated since then. If you are to look in the crosstabs of some of these polling, And if you look at the ways in which people would self-identify to pollsters, you will see people very commonly self-identifying as evangelical Christian. These are white Republican voters. But then later in that same research set, that same data set, they'll say that they don't attend church. And in many cases, that they haven't attended church in many years. So then what is it about the label of evangelical? What is it about that identifier that somehow still speaks to them? And I think that is obviously at the core of what I'm trying to diagnose here in the book.
Some of these radical evangelical leaders that you quote, that you study, talk about having to go to war, possibly to take back their country. Take it back from whom?
Well, you don't have to read between the lines much. If you were to look back at that period in the 1970s, this is one of the great ironies, I think. This Armageddon rhetoric, this doomsday, sky is falling sort of routine that you would hear. The irony at that time was that the country was still 90% white, 90% Christian. Everybody went to church on Sundays. There was a change beginning to take root in America, but it was not drastic by really any measure. If you fast forward now 50 or 60 years to where we are today, the country is, without question, very, very dramatically different than it was. And that's true culturally, economically, demographically. And I think what's interesting is that when you have a white Christian majority that really, for the first time in this country's history, is seeing its status erode, seeing its numbers, its influence, its sort of stronghold on cultural institutions erode, then it creates this sort of panic. And so enter someone like Donald Trump, who, when he says, make America great again, and then speaking even more specifically to evangelical audiences, Donald Trump has said that, well, you are under siege, right? They want to take this country away from you. If you look at the data, if you look at all the social science, it's not very difficult to conclude who they is, right? They is anyone who is not a white conservative Christian who would dare to try to vie for a place of influence, whether it be in our political arena, in business, in culture, in the academy, wherever. And I think to appreciate just how dire that threat is perceived to be, you have to first recognize that there is more than a kernel of truth to the idea that Christians are sort of losing this country, right? So let me be very clear what I mean by that, because I'll get this question all the time, and it's the right question. People will say, well, can you understand why some Christians would feel under siege? Can you understand the sort of persecution complex that so many of these people give voice to? And my answer is, well, of course I can. If you think back to 2008, Barack Obama runs for president and is very, very clear in his platform during that campaign that he believes that marriage is between one man and one woman. And 8 years later, when he leaves office, the law of the land, as decreed by the Supreme Court, is that marriage is legal between same-sex couples. So in the space of 8 years, you have probably the most progressive president of our lifetimes, at least to that point, who had campaigned saying, well, no, I believe in the biblical definition of marriage, one man and one woman. In the space of 8 years, the country has then legalized same-sex marriage, and you can understand why, for tens of millions of traditional conservative Christians who hold to that teaching about marriage being between one man and one woman, you can understand why their heads might be spinning a little bit, saying, well, hold on a second. Wait, where did this come from, right? What is happening here? You can understand how the culture at large is not reflective of the sort of core, the very traditional pious Christianity that it once was. I mean, it doesn't take much of an experiment listening to music or watching television or just sort of engaging with the culture to see the ways in which there has been a coarsening, a degrading of the culture in the eyes of those Christians. So yes, the country is changing. Yes, the country's sort of unwritten rules and social mores and customs are changing. But that begs the question, how then should we respond to it as Christians? If we believe that this threat is real, do we respond by doubling down on our efforts to live out a faithful witness for Jesus Christ and to demonstrate to the world around us what the virtues and the values that we believe in? Or do we fight fire with fire? Do we see the corseting of the culture all around us and decide that if we're going to win, then we need to coarsen ourselves a little bit as well? And what we've seen in the evangelical movement overwhelmingly is an embrace of that latter option. The idea being that, well, the barbarians are at the gates, and maybe we need a barbarian to protect us. And that is,
You've spent 4 years looking at this movement, examining, I think, some of the most radical parts of it. When they talk about going to war to take back their country, what are some of the things, specific things they're talking about? Tactics? Are they really talking about war?
well, when I mentioned a barbarian being their best ally, someone who's willing to not just go to war for them, but someone who's willing to not play by the rules of conventional warfare, someone who's willing and able to do the dirty work, to color way outside the lines. That is what makes Donald Trump, in particular, such an appealing, if very unorthodox and otherwise head-scratching choice for so many of these Christians to ally themselves with. When you ask about the tactics, about the methods, we don't have to look back very far to understand why January 6th came to be such a significant moment for millions of these individuals that I'm writing about and that I'm speaking about here. Because if you come to self-select into a different epistemological existence, and let me be clear what I mean by that. I think for one of the great unappreciated, I think, shifts in our modern culture, specifically as it pertains to the church, the evangelical movement, is information consumption and where that information is coming from and what people in the pews are reading and listening to that is then shaping their worldview and shaping their approach to politics and culture and everything else. And I think what we've seen in recent years is a real radicalizing of that information diet. And you don't have to take my word for it. I've traveled the country and talked with dozens and dozens of pastors of conservative churches who have said the same thing, that effectively they're dealing with a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories inside of their churches. And so when Donald Trump, who has successfully presented himself to many of their congregants as a sort of political messiah, as someone who is single-handedly capable of keeping those barbarians outside of the gates, of restoring the idyllic white Christian America that they once knew for them. When he, in turn, says that the election has been stolen from him and that the same forces that have been indoctrinating their children and taking over American life and pushing Christianity to the margins and persecuting these people for their beliefs, that those same forces have have rigged the election against him, and that you, good Christian soldier, you need to be willing to take a stand now with me to prevent this from happening, because if they get away with it, our country will never be the same. We might never get it back. So that's why January 6th emerges as this flashpoint in the evangelical subculture. It's why you see people praying and forming prayer circles outside of the Capitol and singing hymns and carrying crosses with them and all of the religious imagery around the Capitol that day, because it was perceived to be not political warfare, but spiritual warfare in a very real sense. That threat that I'm describing there is, I think, only intensifying. In other words, we should not look back at January 6th as the moment where this climaxed. We should look back at January 6th as the moment that it was sort of sparked. But by no means have we seen the worst of it yet, unless there is a very real, serious effort on the part of Christians specifically, but also institutions in the country to try and grapple with this threat moving forward.
A lot of evangelicals have merged then patriotism with religion, right? They're declaring a Christian, they would like a Christian America as a kind of a state religion. What's wrong with that?
Well, there are a lot of things wrong with it. First and foremost, if you look at it from a civics perspective, the First Amendment of the Constitution does not allow for the establishment of any sort of state religion. In fact, it guarantees a freedom of religion and a freedom from religious coercion by the state. And there is nothing less patriotic than attempting to rewrite the First Amendment and establish a theocratic rule in this country, all because you feel threatened by the rising number of non-Christians in this country. If you feel threatened by the rising number of non-Christians in this country, the remedy is Jesus, and in increasingly higher doses. And if you believe that God is sovereign, and if you believe that you have been born for such a time as this, then what an opportunity. What an opportunity for you as a Christian to share your witness with the world around you. But I think this is where the threat and the opportunity, they are in sort of direct conflict. In other words, I grew up not far from Ann Arbor, Michigan, which when I was a child, I heard described more than once as Sodom and Gomorrah inside of my church, right? I live near Ann Arbor, Michigan now as an adult. And at my church, which is located in Ann Arbor, my pastor is fond of saying to us all the time, like, hey, have you ever looked around and said, wow, how lucky am I to live in Ann Arbor? Like, what a great place to be as a Christian. What an opportunity in a town that is not defined by Christian values and Christian virtues, and where we don't see a lot of church attendance. What a great opportunity for you to let your light shine, to show people the love of Christ, and to really be authentic in living out your witness for the gospel. That is the fundamental challenge here, is do we see these things as a threat, or do we see them as an opportunity? And sadly, much of what we see wrapped up in this sort of patriotic zeal, this mission to baptize America into a sort of Christian mythology, and to literally rewrite the history books to then support this crusade, pun intended, to establish Christian dominion in this country. It not only runs against the core civic virtues of being an American, but it also is completely antithetical to the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We as Christians should know better than anyone that we belong to a kingdom that is not of this world, that we have our citizenship in that kingdom, and that God does not care about our national identity. He does not wave a flag in heaven. He does not think that we are special because we are Americans. And so to push for this sort of Christian nationalist agenda, in many ways, is just it's ironic and it's sad and it's laughable because Christian nationalism is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. There's no coherent philosophical argument to be made for the idea of Christian nationalism.
You see a parallel then between, you talk about it in your book, between Christian nationalism, if you will, in the United States, and Putin basically advocating for almost a state religion in Russia, fighting a sacred war to take over the Ukraine, for instance.
Yeah, I think one of the parallels there that's really striking is how Putin, who is himself not a religious man, has very successfully appropriated religious language to then create the justification for not only invading Ukraine, but the justification for the brutal, dehumanizing tactics used in the war, and to rally the public around this effort, which has been sort of this quagmire and this stalemate for the Russians. Because if it was just a land war, if it was just a geopolitical conflict, if it was just another bloody battle between neighboring nation states, then the Russian public might very well have lost its appetite by now. But if you can frame it, if you can reframe it as a sort of cosmic spiritual clash between the forces of good and evil, and that we are not just fighting military opponents in Ukraine, but we are fighting Nazis, we are fighting demons, we are fighting Satan himself, right? Then you suddenly draw from a much deeper well of public support. And that's not only has Putin done that very effectively, but he has also formed an alliance with the Russian Orthodox Church and really, in some ways, made the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, the front man for some of that messaging. Patriarch Kirill has really become the second most powerful man in Russia, and his messaging to the public, which of course works in tandem with Putin's messaging, has been incredibly effective because the Russian public, they hear his words not as the words of a leader of state or as a politician, but as almost a voice of God here on earth, speaking to them with that level of spiritual authority. So if you survey that situation in Russia and in Ukraine and understand how successful this brutal authoritarian tyrant and his regime have been in appropriating that religious language and then weaponizing it to wage war, not only on their enemies across the border in Ukraine, but really waging war to crush dissent within Russia, to say, we will not tolerate any form of dissent from the progressives, from the gays, from the enemies of the church in Russia, because we understand that this is a spiritual conflict. It's not a political conflict. These are not political disagreements. These are theological disagreements. If you see how successful Putin has been with that playbook in Russia, then you can start to understand why any number of other autocrats or aspiring authoritarians around the world, including Donald Trump, find it incredibly compelling, and why they might just try to take a page out of that playbook if given the chance.
Has a similar process been going on in the state of Israel recently?
That's right. Listen, let's be clear. I had somebody say to me after reading that chapter in the book, they said, well, it's not like Vladimir Putin invented this. And I said, yeah, no kidding. You're right. The religious justification for mass conflict and for, let's be clear, not just for mass conflict, but for genocide, for ethnic cleansing, for crimes against humanity, that has been going on for millennia. And in a Christian context, It's been going on since the middle of the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine claims to have, had an experience with the risen Christ and converted to Christianity. And that really is, for Christians anyway, that is sort of the genesis of many of our problems for the last 1700 or so years, is understanding the temptation that many Christians have had since Constantine, in times of certainty, in times of trouble, in times where they have felt marginalized or ostracized or persecuted even, to then turn to the power of a politician or a military ruler, or the power of the state, to try to fight back against their enemies and try to reclaim power. And I think that merging of religious fanaticism, religious conviction, at least, with a sort of geopolitical agenda, is a recipe for trouble. And if you and to be, I guess, even one level more explicit, the religious zeal merged with authoritarian impulses is disastrous. And that is the recipe that we see that plays out throughout world history. I don't know that that's exactly the recipe playing out in the Middle East conflict at this moment, but it's something not far removed from that. And we have on both sides of that conflict, mind you, and we have, I think, a responsibility, whatever the context, whatever the faith tradition in question. We have a responsibility, those of us who are invested in living in a pluralistic society and living at peace with our friends and our neighbors and our enemies alike, to emphasize that shared history and do everything we can to avoid a repeat of it.
At the end of your book, which I found fascinating, but I found it difficult at the end to decide how optimistic you really are about the possibility of reclaiming the evangelical movement from the radical right.
Well, okay. So I'm not a terribly optimistic person by nature, at least as it pertains to the things that I can see, the things right in front of me, right? So what I can see from a couple of decades reporting on politics and religion and American culture and the fracturing of our society along these fault lines of race and class and political tribe and whatnot, I'm not terribly optimistic about this country at the moment. And I can't say that I'm terribly optimistic about the evangelical movement. However, I would add two caveats. The first one is that in both cases, in the church more specifically, but in the country more broadly, I do have some optimism because I have seen the younger generations at work. And I don't mean the kids who you're seeing on CNN right now taking over their college campuses. I think that is a very vocal fringe minority. But I think the great numbers of young people who I have had the good fortune of encountering and engaging in conversation all around the country in recent years, these young people, they think about a lot of these problems very differently than their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation. And I think that they are really committed to some of these core values of pluralism in ways that maybe their parents weren't. And I see that even at places like Liberty University, which was founded, of course, by Jerry Falwell in the 1970s. And Liberty has come to be viewed as like an avatar of the corruption and the abuse and the kind of the indoctrination to turn Christians into these belligerent, militant, culture warriors. And yet, even at a place like Liberty, where I've spent a lot of time reporting in recent years, I have met so many young people there who they might be very conservative personally in their theology, in their politics, in their personal beliefs, but they want nothing to do with Trumpism. They want nothing to do with this angry, slash and burn populism. They see where that has gotten us, and they want something different. They want to be able to live at peace with their enemies, real and perceived, in the culture. And I think that's going to take time to get there, because these younger generations are young. They are far removed from positions of that sort of influence and power to try to right the ship. But I do think that if we are able to get through this interim period of the next, couple of decades, if we're able to sort of get through and see to the other side, I think that the future will be brighter. And then, just if I can add, my other cause of optimism is I am a Christian, and I believe that, as my father used to say from the pulpit, that God does not bite his fingernails, that we have been coddled in America to expect a comfort and a tranquility that is just not realistic in most of the world, and certainly throughout most of history. And so when we hit these bumps in the road and some of this turbulence that we're feeling right now, we start to freak out, and we turn on each other, and we get nasty, and we think the end is near. And who knows, maybe it is. But ultimately, my identity is not found in being an American. My purpose in life is not to fight for any certain set of ideals or values in this country. I mean, those things are important to me, but ultimately my identity is found in following Jesus and in believing that I belong to a kingdom that is not of this world, and that God is good, and that God is sovereign, despite the ephemeral and fleeting and ugly conflicts that we are constantly exposed to here in this world. So that is the great optimism that I am always clinging to.
If dedicated evangelicals like yourself are eventually unable to reform the evangelical movement, to win it back, would you consider leaving it and creating something else?
It's a good question, and I would even hesitate at this stage in my life to identify as an evangelical, not because I don't know lots of good and godly and sincere evangelicals, and not because I think that there's something inherently wrong with the label, but I do worry that at a certain point the label can do more harm than good. And I think that that's the place where a lot of people my age are. I'm just shy of 40 years old, and for my generation and for the younger generation of believers, I think that they recognize the baggage that's now attached to that terminology. And so whether it's consciously or subconsciously, whether they do it very publicly or just more privately, I think a lot of us are beginning to rethink our branding, if you will, rethink the way that we present ourselves to the outside world. Because once a brand takes on enough damage, then there's really no repairing it. And I think that the evangelical brand is getting pretty close to that point. And if ultimately our commission as Christians is to present the gospel in a compelling way to those on the outside who do not know Christ, then why would we let that label be an impediment? Why would we let it get in the way of that witness? And so that's just where I'm at personally.
Tim, it's been a great pleasure and honor talking with you. I'm going to turn things back over to Jim Bitterman now with the questions from our audience. Jim?
Thanks, Barry and Tim. In fact, just want to remind everybody that if you've got questions for Tim, use the chat function on your Zoom link there and write them out for all of us to see. We've got a question from Anne Montgomery, who wants to know, she says, you've written groundbreaking articles on a variety of subjects. Your takedown of CNN and Chris Licht, which, by the way, was intently read by a lot of my colleagues at CNN, particularly comes to mind. What's your process, and how do you have a hero or a role model in journalism?
Well, a hero or a role model in journalism. It's probably a disappointing answer, but not really. I in many ways sort of backed into what I'm doing now. But my interest in journalism as a young guy was really to try to be a sports writer, to try to be a baseball writer, and travel around the country and go to all the ballparks and write some of the sweeping romantic stories about America's pastime. That was sort of the ideal for me as a 19-year-old. And then through a series of happy accidents and coincidences, I sort of found myself covering politics, and I've enjoyed covering politics. But it is certainly a bit of a soul-crushing endeavor, particularly over the past decade or so. I guess that I've drawn from a number of different influences, people who have, historians, like David McCullough, and I think more contemporary. I work with a couple of colleagues at The Atlantic, George Packer, Mark Leibovich, guys who are just sort of living legends, at least in my eyes, who I've really admired and drawn from. But I've kind of tried to create my own style, and my process is, at this point in my career, I'm really just focused on big, deep, groundbreaking feature pieces. I don't spend a lot of time chasing the news cycle anymore, which is a lovely place to be, because I was starting to lose my sanity a little bit in doing so. So I will typically be working on 2 or 3 long pieces in the space of a year, give or take, and those pieces will take me anywhere from 4, 5 months all the way up to 7, 8, 10 months, 12 months to complete. And I guess the simplest way of explaining the process is I'm really, most of the pieces I'm interviewing, at least 50 people, often closer to 100 or even more than 100 people. And those interviews are mostly in person. So I'm traveling a lot. I'm piecing together all the interviews, and then I'm kind of weaving together the story as it's coming clear to me. And then I'm sitting down and writing long drafts and working with editors to refine them. And it's a very, magazine writing in this age of most media outlets are, if they are thriving, they're thriving on shorter, faster, let's get to the point and give you just the bare bones so that you can get on with your day. And what I love about working for The Atlantic is that they have really swam directly upstream into those currents and have really been successful in doing so. We find that when I write a 15,000 word story that takes readers an average of, an hour and 15 minutes to get through, that our subscription rates, that our engagement rates are through the roof with stories like that. And so I feel really blessed to work for a place that's given me those opportunities.
You're very lucky. I don't work for a place like that at all. That is more for what I need to know to get through the day. So Russell Kelly wants to know, are there certain religious sects, and I think he means probably branches of Christianity, that are more or less prone to political evangelism? For example, Baptists or Lutherans or Catholics. Are there any of them that are more prone to the message of the political evangelist?
Well, I mean, yeah, look, so you have a kind of a basic fracture in American Christianity, first between the Roman Catholics and the Protestants. And so that's worth understanding, of course. Now, I'll get into the Protestants more, but first I'll quickly say that on the Roman Catholic side, excuse me, you really have a divide there in the church that's become really very clear in recent years. And there's kind of a fragile alliance holding the Roman Catholic Church together right now. And that split is really pretty well defined along, surprise, surprise, cultural and political lines. So if you look at the issue of abortion, if you look at the issue of, excuse me, of same-sex marriage, if you look at even things like climate change, which Pope Francis has spoken about. You know, those are kind of the core issues that that Catholics in the American church certainly have really split around. Now, in the Protestant wing, it's sort of a similar story. You have the mainline Protestant denominations, which tend to be more culturally and politically liberal, or at least left of center. And then you have the more evangelical friendly denominations. So, for example, you know, in the mainline, as it's known, the mainline would be, you know, a lot of Lutheran churches, a lot of Methodist churches, a lot of you know, the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, is a large denomination. Those are the main line left of center, sort of culturally, socially, politically churches. And then some of the denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention, the Assembly of God, the PCA, the Presbyterian Church of America, the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, the Evangelical Lutherans. Those churches tend to be much more right of center or right wing with their culture and their politics. So I started my homily here by talking about how uniquely American some of these problems are. And what I'm describing there is also pretty uniquely American. Not that you don't see any of this in other churches around the world, but it's far less common. I guess what I mean by that is if you are in Europe talking with the few remaining churchgoers in Europe, or if you are in Central America or Asia, you would not know someone's political affiliations necessarily based on what church they go to, right? Whereas in America, you are going to have a very, very good idea, at least I would as an expert in this topic, based on if someone tells me what kind of church they go to, I would almost immediately, even if I don't know who they voted for, because let's face it, right? I mean, part of what I'm describing is this split among evangelicals about Trump himself and about the Republican Party of present day, and how many of these conservative Christians don't feel comfortable with Donald Trump as a man, as a political leader, and so they're holding out and they can't bring themselves to vote for him. But odds are they're still, based on the church they go to, they hold to a set of principles, values, you know, ideologies that are pretty predictable based on the religious tradition they come from. And that's, again, a pretty uniquely American phenomenon.
Ann Morrison wants to know, she says, you said that January 6th could only be the beginning. So what could be next?
Well, look, I don't want to just speculate irresponsibly. I think that I don't want to be cute in saying this, but I think you can use your imagination to think about what could come next. I mean, what I've described here is not abstract. It's a very real, clear, and present threat that we are dealing with here in this country. With according to the data and the polling, the social science we have around this, an increasing number of Americans who are sort of merging their religious identity with their national identity and their political identity, and becoming much more comfortable with the idea of political violence, becoming much more comfortable with the idea of controlling this country through undemocratic means, who are becoming much more comfortable with the arguments around theocracy and you know, one thing that I've pointed to that people are surprised by and in some cases shocked by, and I just think they don't realize the scope of the threat that we're dealing with here. There was a large conference a couple of years ago called the National Conservatism Conference, and it was attended by a number of prominent Republican office holders, governors, senators, presidential candidates. And this conference on what it means to be not just a conservative, but a nationalist conservative. What does it mean? And they were defining their terms and arguing over these things for a couple of days. Well, there was a statement of principles that ultimately came out of that conference. And this statement of principles was undersigned by scores and scores of very influential, prominent conservatives in this country, people who are very well placed in American politics and who would play an outsized role, many of them in a second Trump administration. And in that statement of principles, there's a section on religion in public life. And what that section says in plain text right there for you to read it, if you want to look it up, it says that non-Christians will be protected from religious coercion in their private homes and in their private lives. That is what the statement of principles says, and is signed by a lot of these very prominent and influential conservative actors. So they're telling you very plainly that if given the opportunity, they would not hesitate as national conservatives who feel besieged and persecuted in this moment and who are intent on taking back this country. They're telling you that if given the opportunity, they would gladly do away with the First Amendment, and they would gladly seek to impose some sort of religious litmus test in public life, and that they would seek to, in some sense, effectively merge church and state, and that they would. And by the way, we should not be surprised by any of this. I mean, Donald Trump has, on numerous occasions during this campaign, said publicly in front of thousands of people at these rallies that if president, he will think about not letting anyone into the country anymore unless they are a Christian. That you can't come to this country as a migrant anymore unless you pass a religious litmus test. So these people are not hiding the ball on us. I mean, this is not some elaborate wink and nod scheme. It's very much out in the open. And I think the question is, for those of us who can see it for what it is, are we willing to speak out about it and try to oppose it in a way that can actually make a difference?
That's a very interesting and kind of chilling thought. Connie Board would like to know if there's anything in America that you might call a Christian left.
Sure. I am a rare American Christian who does not evaluate your authenticity as a believer based on your party registration. Yes, is there a Christian left? Sure. I think the most visible example of that is probably the Black church, which has been very explicitly political and in many cases very explicitly partisan for a very long time. Which, by the way, if you're wondering, well, you've been denouncing the explicit political, the explicit partisan political gamesmanship coming out of the white evangelical church. Are you okay with it in the Black progressive church? And my answer is no, I'm not. I believe that the perversion of the gospel for political ends is appalling and inappropriate wherever we see it. And so I have no issue calling it out on the far right or on the far left or anywhere in between. But do I believe that there are self-identified liberals, self-identified progressives who are very sincere and devout followers of Jesus? Of course I do. Yes, I've met many of them. And I think that there are many of them also on the political, cultural right. I think the sad reality is that for many of these people on either the left or the right, they have a very difficult time seeing one another as being sincere and have a very hard time recognizing, have a very hard time recognizing the Holy Spirit in one another, because we have been conditioned in this American moment to process everything through a filter of right versus left, elephants versus donkeys. And if you're a Republican, you have come to view Jesus as a mascot for the Republicans. And if you're a Democrat, you've come to view Jesus as a mascot for the Democrats. And so, yes, I do see a political left and a Christian left. And while much of their activity at an institutional level, if they're merging those identities together, I'm very uncomfortable with. I do think that you can be a very committed and sincere Christian if you are a far left progressive, the same way that I think you can be a sincere and devout Christian if you are a committed, far right conservative. If you are able to truly find your identity in Christ first and foremost.
Tim, I think on that positive note, I think we're going to probably have to wrap things up. We've been going for about an hour here, and I want to thank you very, very much for joining us this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are. Barry, thank you, and thanks to our technical manager, Alfonso Shogun, for bringing us all together. And of course, thanks to all of you out there for joining us today and sending in your donations. For those who haven't, just a reminder that you can contribute via the link that was sent out along with the notice for this webinar. Have a great day, everyone.